you guys would tell me what either the questions you're debating, where some of the rough spots are, some of the contradictions you're wrestling with, or anything else you'd like me to get started. I can start, but I'd like to know where I should start.
Well, can we start with you just for a minute? And could you tell us just a bit about your own becoming in terms of social justice and as an educator and activist?
Sure, no problem, absolutely. So one of the things that happened. Well, here's what happened to me. I was I came out of a very privileged background, growing up in the 1950s in the Midwest outside Chicago. Very privileged upbringing, a, a white person in a multicultural society that was quite segregated. And I went from a prep school, a little boarding school, to the University of Michigan in 1963. And at Michigan, my eyes were opened through a series of kind of jolts or shocks. And I describe what happened to me is that I was coming out of a kind of a cocoon, and my eyes were opened, and because my eyes were opening and I was awakening to a world much larger than the world that I knew, I was shocked to see that the world was a place of dislocation, a place of pain, a place of war, a place of racial violence, and so I was drawn into the social movements of those years. So I was drawn into the civil rights movement. I was first arrested in 1965 at the first International Days of Protest against the war in Vietnam. That was quite an experience for a kid from my background to find myself in a county jail, and then because I was misbehaving, put into solitary confinement, and that was shocking to me. And I often tell young people the best way to get a good look at your country is to go to jail. I don't really mean that. I want all of you to stay out of jail, but there's something enlightening about seeing a society that you had seen from one angle of regard to a very different angle of regard. So I dropped out of school. Well, I went to school in 1963 to the university, got involved in the civil rights movement, found the education system very, very alienating at that point for me. And so I quit college and I went south, and the movement it was the winter, and so the movement was in a kind of a lull, and I joined the Merchant Marines, and I was shipped out of New Orleans, and I went to Greece, and I was in the Constitution Square when I first heard the word Vietnam. I picked up the International Herald Tribune, and there was a story about Vietnam. I'd never heard of it. I came back and got very engaged with a group that was trying to understand the war and trying to educate people about the war. And then I was arrested. Things picked up from there. So I'll tell you real quickly, I don't want to drag this out too much, but I was first arrested opposing the war in 1965. Over the next 3 years, I was arrested numerous times opposing the war. And the interesting thing is, though, that all that time, I was also becoming a teacher. I had met in jail some people who'd organized a freedom school affiliated with the civil rights movement. And I could tell you, maybe I should tell you a bit about my inauguration into the freedom schools, but I walked out of jail and into my first teaching job. And the reason that that's interesting, I think, is because for me, there's never been a separation or a gap between teaching and social justice. They've always seemed linked to me. Now, I don't think that's true for everybody, but I was lucky because I learned to teach in a school that was dedicated to the civil rights movement. And that was the movement, as I'm sure you read, even though a lot of what you read is mythology, but that was the movement to end segregation and ultimately to end racism in the United States. And of course, we did not succeed in either of those goals, but those were lofty goals and they were important goals. So I grew up as a teacher, in this kind of tradition of freedom schools. And have you read at all about the freedom schools in Mississippi or no?
No.
Not at all? Okay, let me tell you real quickly because I think you'll find it, I hope you'll find it interesting. So the freedom schools, you know, I said that the history that we read is often mythologized. So we read some about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the United States, but it's kind of this mythology that there was once a guy who had a dream and led a bus boycott and was a saint and went on to make America a better place. But none of that is true. And like any social movement, it had hills and valleys that were very difficult to negotiate. So in 1963, when the movement was at a low point, a young volunteer from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee made a proposal that we start something he called freedom schools. And this was not a proposal to the government or a proposal to the foundations. It was actually just a mimeograph sheet, a page and a half. And if you don't know what a mimeograph is, you can Google it, not now, but later. Because a mimeograph is an old-timey way of copying things. So Charlie Cobb was this guy. He wrote a proposal, and here's what the essence of the proposal said. The Black people of Mississippi have been denied things: decent schools, fully trained teachers, forward-looking curriculum. But the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how those circumstances could be changed. Think about that. What he's saying is that the main problem that the Black kids have is that they've been denied intellectual freedom. They've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives. How did we get here? Where are we going? What do we want? And how could our lives be otherwise? That was a revolutionary thing to say. And my evidence that it was a revolutionary thing to say is that freedom schools all over the South were firebombed by the racists, by the Ku Klux Klan. And the three of the martyrs of Mississippi, whose names are Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, were freedom school teachers, and they were investigating an arson bombing when they were kidnapped and lynched. This became one of the great, huge turning moments in the civil rights movement, all about these freedom schools. So think of that statement that I just made, and think about some of the kids that you work with, or some of the kids that you know of in Toronto or Vancouver or Regina. Think of this phrase. The kids have been denied many things: fully trained teachers, decent progressive forward-looking curriculum, decent facilities. But the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they could be otherwise. That applies to the kids on the west side of Chicago. It applies to the kids in Watts in Los Angeles. It applies to the kids in the Bronx in New York City. And it is a revolutionary statement. That's how I learned to teach. So we generated off of that proposal a freedom school curriculum. And the curriculum, like I think all good progressive curricula, the curriculum was a curriculum of dialogue and a curriculum of questions. So you can look this up online. It's called the 1964 Mississippi Freedom School Curriculum. And it begins like this. It begins with three questions. And the three primary questions are, why are you and I in the civil rights movement? What do we hope to accomplish? What do we want to keep? And what do we want that the majority culture has, and what do we want to keep that we have? Another way of saying those same questions, and this resonated throughout the freedom schools, is where are we coming from? Who are we? And where are we going? Those are revolutionary questions. Those are radical questions. So for me, I've never seen social justice as an add-on to an existing curriculum. I've always seen social justice as the essence of education and democracy. It requires dialogue, it requires question asking, it requires problem posing. So one of the things I do with my graduate students often is I ask them to write a freedom school curriculum around any venue, anything, any problem, any issue. Think about that for a minute. Could you write a freedom school curriculum, a curriculum of dialogue, a curriculum of problem posing, a curriculum of question asking around anything that's worth studying? Think about it. So here's an example. I have many examples, and my students come up with brilliant things. But here's an example that I love because I thought of it. So I love it for that reason alone. But the governor of Arkansas was a man named Mike Huckabee, and his daughter was President Trump's press secretary. You've heard of him, Mike Huckabee?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so he was a very large person. He weighed 380 pounds, and he lost a huge amount of weight over a few year period, and he became an advocate for against childhood obesity. So good for him. But here's what's weird. In Arkansas, they put into people's report cards, the report cards that students took home, they put, along with your grade for English and math and science, they put your body mass index. Can you imagine? So you get a report card and it says, you got an A in math, you got a B in English, and you're fat. I mean, what an amazing thing to go home with, right? And so here's my challenge to myself. How do I make a freedom school curriculum out of that initiative in Arkansas? And here's how I would do it. Remember, it's about dialogue, it's about question asking, it's about problem posing. So I would say, for example, and you don't need to know the answer to these things. I would say, for example, what's the state of our physical education programs in the schools in Arkansas? What's the state of our parks nearby the high school? What's the state of our, who owns the franchise to the snack bar and the lunchroom in our high school? What's the state of our sports programs? And on and on. In other words, I'm not saying my freedom school curriculum around the body mass index is not saying you're an idiot, let me educate you about why this is a wrong thing to do. It's a curriculum of asking questions, getting the kids involved, getting anyone involved, students of any age and any place, getting them involved in interrogating the world before them. Because to me, the revolutionary idea is not only do you have a right to be here, and I'm speaking to every one of you as well as every one of your students, the message is you have a right to be here. Nobody can tell you you shouldn't be here as a human being. You have a right to be here fully who you are. And secondly, you need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You need no one's permission to interrogate the world. You can ask questions of the universe. That's what social justice, in my mind, is all about. Of course, it's about equity. Of course, it's about access. Of course, it's about fairness. And those are concepts that kids understand intuitively, and they call us on our hypocrisy always. That's what's great about working with kids, isn't it? They're always telling you you're a hypocrite. I love that because they're catching us on our nonsense. But if we say to kids, you need no one's permission to interrogate the universe. You have every right, and you can follow your own curiosity, and I'll be there as your helper. Those to me are the essence of social justice. One other thing I would say, when people define social justice as access, I want to always, always, always add a third element, and that is recognition. That social justice is about recognition, recognizing the humanity of the human beings in front of you, not thinking that they're a collection of deficits, not thinking that they don't have within them the answers to the profound questions of our times. So one way I think of this is, and this is why I was lucky when I was 20 years old to land in such a place, because I've discovered, I think I could tell you this, that when I first started teaching, I thought a teacher was somebody who stood in front of the class and dispensed knowledge, right? Isn't that what we all think? We think of a teacher. They're the one at the front of the class telling people things that they need to know. But what I discovered, so I was a kindergarten teacher when I was 20, I started teaching. And I went, as I say, out of jail into my first teaching job. And I was in my first classroom for about 15 minutes when a 5-year-old said to me, "Why does the ball bounce?" And I said to myself, "Oh shit, I don't even know. This 5-year-old has stumped me. I'm pretending to be a teacher. I don't even know that. And by the end of the first morning, I didn't know why my skin was pink and her skin was brown. I didn't know why the sky was blue. I mean, thank God I knew why the floor was sticky when we spilled apple juice, but that was the only thing I knew. So I was completely ignorant. I was a complete idiot. And they all knew it. And that created a crisis for me, but the crisis was resolved, not resolved. I would say the crisis has never been resolved, but I was able to get a hold of it after a couple of years. And the crisis was, if a teacher isn't standing in front of the room dispensing knowledge, what does a teacher do? And I moved from being a kind of a captain of the ship. I moved from that to thinking that my job was unlocking the wisdom in the room, unlocking the wisdom in the room. And the assumption that I make today and that I started making when I was a young teacher is that every room has wisdom. And your job is to find it, not to know everything, but to find the wisdom and unlock it. That means creating places where people can face one another without masks. That means finding ways to provoke people to think. I'm going to give you one example, but it's a different assignment than the assignment of knowing things, writing lesson plans, and teaching things. It's a very different assignment. I'll give you two quick examples. One, I just learned the other night from a friend of mine who's a great teacher. He's out on strike right now in Chicago. I'll tell you about that too. But this is a friend of mine, and he teaches teenagers, middle school. And he was really angry at this one kid. The kid was misbehaving, acting up, being an idiot, and the teacher was about to explode. So he took him out in the hallway. He's not a very strict disciplinary, but he took this kid out in the hallway, and he was about to read him the riot act and tell him all the things he'd done wrong, which of course the kid knew all the things he'd done wrong. So it's kind of repetitive to just tell him. But the genius thing that my friend did is he got out in the hallway, took a deep breath, and he said to the kid who'd been misbehaving, "You talk first." Isn't that cool? You talk first. And what happened is the kid told him all the stuff that was going on in his life that morning that was driving him crazy. And that gave my friend an opportunity to see him, to recognize him, not just to see him as a misbehaving nightmare, but to see him as he saw himself, in context, struggling. So my granddaughter, I'm going to give you one last example, and then I'm going to ask you to interrupt. So my granddaughter, who's now 12, but when she was 10, I was talking to her about who her favorite teacher was, and she told me his name is Mr. Rob, and he's her favorite teacher. He was her fourth grade teacher. And I said, what's great about Mr. Rob? And she told me a bunch of neat things about how he greets the kids in the morning and how he's strict but kind. You can imagine how a 10-year-old thinks of a good teacher. He's kind of no nonsense, but at the same time, he's generous and kind. And then I said to her, "What's his teaching signature?" And she said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Well, what makes him different than other teachers?" And she said, "Oh, that's easy, curiosity." I said, "How do you know that?" And she said, "Well, the first day of class, he gave every one of us a book with our name on it. And he calls it our wonder books. And when we have a question, he says, put that in your wonder book. And he never answers a direct question. He always asks another question." And I said, "For example," she said, "Well, I was reading a story and I said to him, what's the difference between a wild turkey and a domesticated turkey?" And he said, "What do wild turkeys eat?" And I said, "What's the life expectancy of a wild turkey?" And he said, "What's the range of a wild turkey?" And he said, "Put all those in your wonder book and don't Google it and don't try to answer it. Just marinate on it." That's the word she used. He's 10. He said, "Just marinate on the questions." That's a really interesting teacher. Every week, he puts on the board question of the week. Now think of this. This is fourth grade. These are 9 and 10-year-olds. He puts on the board the question of the week. The question of the week, when I asked her, "Well, give me an example," she said, "Well, one day he put up, what's the difference between a problem and an issue?" These kids are 10. I thought that was so cool. And then another week he put up, in what ways are you a good citizen of this classroom and this school? Damn, I mean, what a great guy. So to me, those are, they could be seen as mundane, but to me, all those examples I'm giving you are examples of freedom school teaching. They're examples of unlocking the wisdom in the room. They're examples of fairness and justice, and on a level that's, you could say, well, it's tiny, but to me, it's not tiny. It's huge, that these kids are able to ask questions of the universe and not settle on easy answers, and not think that school, they don't think, my granddaughter and her classmates do not think of that classroom as a place of transactional knowledge. They think of it as a place of invention and curiosity and interest and pursuing your own ideas. What a great gift that is. That lasts for a lifetime. The other stuff we teach tends to disappear in a minute.
Nice.
Okay. Now, have I put you to sleep, or what happened?
A lot of nodding. A lot of smiles and nodding here. While we're waiting for maybe some people to formulate a question or a response or some kind of dialogue, tell us about the Chicago teacher strike. We're very excited to learn about it. We've been reading. One of the things we saw was that affordable housing piece. What an amazing development in Chicago. What's the scene like? You're in Chicago?
Well, I've been out picketing every morning at 6:30 for the last 9 days, and I should go back. You guys don't really know about the Chicago Teachers Union, right? Not really, or do you?
No.
No, I'd say no.
Really.
So let me go back. The Chicago Teachers Union, like most teachers unions, has been a relatively, I would say, a relatively conservative kind of organization, not particularly forward-looking, not particularly interested in curriculum and teaching, but interested in enforcing a contract and wages and benefits and that kind of thing. In 2010, 9 years ago, a group of teachers who didn't really know each other began seeing each other whenever a school was closed in Chicago by the mayor. And schools are being closed all the time in Chicago because we're losing population. Every time a school was closed, a handful of teachers, 6, 10, 12, 15, from all over the city would show up to be on the side of the parents to say, don't close this school. And that started happening in about 2010. After a couple of years of knowing each other, they said, let's start a study group. And so a group of about 15 teachers began reading books together. They were from kindergarten to high school, and they were from all over the city. But they began sitting down and reading once a month together. And they read, one of the books I know they read was a Canadian. It was Naomi Klein, Disaster Capitalism. I can't remember the name of that book, but the first one, what was the name of that? After No Logo. Anyway, they read a bunch of books together about teaching, about learning, but also about politics. And then one day they said to each other, let's run a slate to be in the leadership of the union. And in 2010, they won that. They won the leadership of the union. A charismatic chemistry teacher, high school chemistry teacher named Karen Lewis was the president. A young guy named Jesse Sharkey was the vice president. Several people of my former students are officers in the union. But they won the election. So now suddenly they were in charge of the union. And the first thing they did is said, we're going to let go all the staff that deal with simply with issues of servicing the contract. And we're going to become a social justice union. We're going to become a social justice union. What does that mean? That meant to them that they were going to build a unity at every school between parents, community, and teachers and students. They weren't going to have teachers versus the community. They were going to have teachers and parents and community and students together. That was a huge shift. And so in 2012, now, meanwhile, are you following me, or am I boring you to death?
Yeah.
This is
So
the
the state of Illinois passed legislation saying that there could not be an authorization for a strike. And they passed this legislation just having to do with the city of Chicago. And they said there could be no strike authorization vote if there were less than 75% of teachers had to vote for authorization of a work stoppage. And we have tapes of them saying to each other, the legislators saying to each other, that's the end of the union. They're done. They're doomed. Comes 2012, and they had a strike authorization vote, and they got a 90% authorization. And why did they get 90%? Because they had built into the union a group of organizers. They hired teachers who were also organizers, and they organized every school in partnership with the parents. So in 2012, they went out on strike. We had a very strong mayor, a very authoritarian mayor. He thought he would put the thing down in 2 minutes. And what ended up happening is that every day, I was on the picket line with my grandchildren. Every day, not only was every school picketed, but every afternoon there was a rally in downtown Chicago. The first rally had 20,000 people. By the fourth day, we had 40,000 people in downtown Chicago, all of us wearing red shirts. Look, I still got mine on, red. But mine, a lot of them say CT, but I won't show you the whole shirt. Okay. But we had 40,000 people in 2012. And the mayor lost the initiative right away because what was interesting was by law, the teachers union could only negotiate benefits and wages by law. And yet downtown with those 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people, they had banners that said, every child deserves an arts program. Every child deserves a nurse. Every child deserves a counselor. We deserve smaller class size. We deserve more prep time. None of that was negotiable. And yet when you went downtown, these banners were so creative and so spontaneous and so fantastic. That was one thing that happened. The second thing that happened is every bus driver, every cab driver, every garbage truck driver, every cop, and every firefighter who drove past our picket lines beeped their horns and held up their fists. It was a community effort, and it was very, very powerful. And we won the strike. We won. It took us, I think, the teachers were out for 5 days. Here's another remarkable thing that marks it as a social justice union. Another remarkable thing is that I lived across the street from an elementary school that had a set of bleachers set up over an athletic field. And the day that the union leadership, the negotiating team, approved a contract, they said, well, we can't go back to work for 2 days. And the school system was, wait, what? Why? What? You approved it. You agreed. Yeah, but we have to have the membership read it and vote on it. And I looked across the street from, and every day there were 50 teachers reading a 200-page contract. It was staggering to watch. That's participatory democracy. That's a bottoms-up union. That's not a top-down thing. So that was 2012. And you may know that the General Motors workers went out a month ago or 40 days ago and just settled their strike. They said when they went out that they were inspired by the 2012 Chicago Teachers Union strike. All the wildcat strikes, you may not have seen this, but it was true in our country that we had wildcat strikes in West Virginia, Arizona, Colorado, Los Angeles, and these were all inspired by the Chicago Teachers Union. So what we're witnessing, you guys and Mark, is what we're witnessing is a social movement performing as a labor struggle, but it's a social movement. And that's a really different thing than I've ever seen before with teachers. So I'm on the picket line every morning. I'm at the rallies every afternoon. We had the mayor introduced her budget last Wednesday. We had 40,000 people surrounding City Hall. The loop was completely shut down. The downtown was completely shut down. And we were demanding that we have a class size cap. In Chicago, we have sometimes a kindergarten with 40 kids in it. Anybody who's taught kindergarten can tell you that's inconceivable. You can't teach. So we want a class size cap. We want a nurse in every school. We want a counselor in every school. So these are the demands and these are the things we're fighting about. Will it go our way? I don't know. But one of the things I find fascinating is that the war of the narrative, and there's always a war over narrative. The war of the narrative has been won by the teachers thus far. That is, if you read even the New York Times, which has been a teacher bashing, teacher hating newspaper for the last couple of decades, they are absolutely getting it right. The reporting from Chicago is basically saying the new mayor promised nurses and class caps and counselors and the mayor's going back on her word. So that's from the New York Times, and I'm kind of shocked. The mayor wants the narrative to be teachers are overpaid, they don't work summers, they're lazy, incompetent. That's her narrative. Our narrative is we deserve a class cap, we deserve nurses, arts programs, and all the rest. So that's a short version of what's going on in Chicago. Pretty exciting to be here.
It's amazing. We're going through our own initial labor negotiations right now where class size and class makeup, the composition is also part of bargaining. And they're also bargaining in public. So the union is making every offer, every sort of move public. It's just public. There's no closed doors.
That's there in Regina?
Yeah.
Saskatchewan.
Yes, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. So it's kind of an exciting time for teachers too, as they, I think governments are ill prepared to deal with that narrative too, that the teachers aren't asking for more money, they're asking for learning conditions for students and safe, inclusive, optimal conditions for learning, for being, for becoming.
Yeah, see, our line here is simple, and that is that good working conditions are good teaching conditions, and good teaching conditions are good learning conditions. So the idea that somehow we should be put off against the students is nonsense. We want good working conditions because we'll be better teachers. We want to be better teachers so kids can be better learners. And it's really an equation that we have to hammer home, because the narrative of lazy, incompetent teachers has been so much the theme song of the austerity people and the government for the last 3 decades in the US. It's been terrible. But I see the tide turning on that. And partly the tide is turning because of the wildcat strikes in places like Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona. Staggering. These are right to work states, meaning right to work for less states. I don't know. I mean, I could explain that, but I think you know what I mean. And so they aren't even allowed to organize unions. And so the wildcat strikes actually, the fascinating thing to me about it, Mark, is that they're neither constrained, they're not constrained by the traditions of labor law. And that means they can have wildcat strikes and march on the Capitol, and it becomes a whole different thing. That's why I call it a social movement. It's a social movement that looks like a labor conflict, but it's way more than that. And I think it's very exciting.
Thanks. I wonder if you've had time to think of something. We had this great opportunity to visit with an exemplary educator and activist. If you have some.
Did you call me an optimist?
Activist.
Oh, activist. Good, because I'm not an optimist. Thank you. An activist. Yes. No, I'm an optimist of the heart and a pessimist of the mind. But yeah, I'm a hopeful person because I don't see how we can get up in the morning if we don't begin to imagine the impossible and see ourselves working toward that. I mean, I think the great antidote to hopelessness and cynicism is action, is activism. I mean, you look at somebody like Greta Thunberg, how can you not be inspired? You look at Standing Rock, how can you not be inspired? You know, it's important stuff. And I think your kids who are camping out in that encampment, how can you not be inspired by that? These kids are saying to us, come on, old people, you screwed it up. Now it's our turn, and we want you to join us. And to me, one of the great privileges we have of being teachers and being in education is we have the great honor of being in the presence of young people who are just formulating their identities, just formulating their outlook on the world, and they have stuff to teach us. They have a lot of stuff to teach us. And you remember when you were 16, you had a lot of stuff to teach the older generation. That's a great thing. We should embrace it and love it. And I do. I feel like sometimes old people get stuck, you know, in their own little worlds, and they patronize kids when what we ought to be doing is becoming students of our students, because they're the real teachers. And that's part of unlocking the wisdom in the room, is becoming a student of your students, finding out what they think and what they want to do.
Some questions? Yeah, you go here and then there.
So we just read an article that talked about different kinds of citizenship education. So there was participatory,
Joel.
Joel Westheimer, right? Yeah.
citizenship versus justice-oriented citizenship. So would you say that it's justice-oriented citizenship should always be the way to go, or is there a place for both, a blending of each? Or because in the article it sort of insinuated maybe that there might be a place for both types depending. I just was wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, I mean, I think, I, I let me see. What I think is that there's always room for everything. So I don't want to be dogmatic and say this is what has to do. What's so brilliant about Joel's work, Joel Westheimer's work on this, is that he really shows you that sometimes we sell ourselves short and we sell our movement short. And what we ought to be doing is kind of ratcheting up our own sense of our own responsibility. The reason I say I don't want to be too dogmatic or single-minded about it is that I really do believe that social change, real social change, is made by people who try everything and that are both impatient and patient. Now, there's a contradiction worth exploring. We have to be impatient enough to demand the impossible. We have to get out of the straitjacket of debating things that are too narrow for us. On the other hand, we have to have the patience to be forgiving of each other, to be demanding of each other, but then forgiving of each other. And both can happen at the same time. So I'm not against, let's go back not only to participatory and justice-oriented, let's go back to charitable. I think it's better to be charitable than to be a greedy pig. I think that's better. On the other hand, I think you can do better than that. I don't think the problem with charity is it brings with it all the condescension and patronizing attitudes that are dehumanizing, not only for those who are being helped, but for the helpers. So I don't want to be charitable. And one of the ways I often think of it in terms of teaching is teachers often use the language of service. We often say, I'm in service to my community, and that's not a bad thing, but I want to go further than that for myself. I want to say, I'm not in service to my students. I'm in solidarity with my students. I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with them. So I want to push you to go as far as you can go, but I don't want to hate on you if you are only able to go so far. I want to bring you along. I want you to be an ally to the deeper struggle. But ally is also kind of the wrong word, because, you know, people say, how can I be an ally to the indigenous struggle? How can I be an ally? As a man, how can I be an ally to women? And I want to argue for myself, and I would argue it to you, but I won't hate on you if you don't agree with me. You know, I want to argue that men should not be should not be allies of women who are fighting for equality and freedom. They should be in solidarity with, and that means they should be comrades with women, and that means I should feel deep in my soul and spirit, I should feel that women being second-class citizens, women being oppressed in any way, whether it's at the workplace and wages, whether it's control of their own bodies and so on, I should find that offensive to me. In other words, I would live a better life if I could get rid of male supremacy. It would be better for me. I might lose a couple of things. I might lose a little advantage on getting this job or that job, but frankly, living in the precarious position of privilege is pukey. That's a word. What does that mean? Icky. You know, who wants to live there? Who wants to live on the precarious position of being better than? I would rather live in a world where women and men are equal, where religious freedom is assumed, where we're not trying to break glass ceilings, but we're living in a society where somebody's queerness is not a question of their humanity, but it's just assumed. I'd rather live in that world. So that means I want to overthrow the system that does exist, that makes women second class, that makes Black people in Chicago, certainly in the United States, second class, that has robbed and looted and continues to perpetuate the violence against indigenous people. I don't want to live in that world. As the great James Baldwin said, when Black people finally free themselves, white people will be free. What did he mean by that? He meant we'd be free from being white, from the great effort it takes to be white, the great effort it takes to be a man in this, masculine toxicity, all that stuff. That's an effort. Wouldn't it be great not to have to play that role? Wouldn't it be wonderful? So that's what I mean by kind of solidarity, not service, or allies is less important to me than comrades. Shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, arm in arm, over the next barricade. That's where I want to live.
Nice.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you a little.
Okay, I'll.
Yeah, come on up. Yeah, here we go. The question hot seat, perfect.
Yeah. Mark had already mentioned a little bit about the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation and how our teachers right now are fighting for classroom composition as well as classroom caps, smaller sizes. How do we go as a federation and battle that battle when provincially, at the provincial level, there's such an overwhelming majority right now that it's hard to fight that battle? I think Alberta, our neighboring province, just announced yesterday or today 2% rollbacks for all public sector workers. That's what their plan is. So when the name of the game is saving money and balanced books, how do we fight that fight for ourselves, for our students?
Well, to me, that's a question we have to face all the time, and the question, how do we fight this fight? But what I like about what you said is you said, you didn't go all the way into it, but you started by saying, here's the situation we're in. They want a 2% rollback of all public employees, et cetera, et cetera. And probably, if we spend a couple of hours around the table, we could probably describe with some precision, we could probably name the political moment we're in with some precision. I mean, I felt you beginning to name the political moment just in that one comment. So don't you think if we sat around for a while, we could say, here's the forces that are aligned against us? Could we do that? We could, right? Okay.
Yeah.
To me, the first step is naming the problem. And the next step is to say, here's 3 or 4 or 5 things that we should undertake collectively to try to counter that problem. And what I mean by that is there is no formula and there's no one-to-one answer. But what there is a series of strategies and tactics we can use to take this on. I'll give you an example. I'll go back in history. I was a student organizer for a long time. I would go to campuses all over Michigan and Ohio in the United States. And one thing that would happen, whenever I would go to a campus, I was an anti-war, anti-racist activist. And I would go to a campus and I was an organizer. And the progressive students would typically say to me, listen, Bill, this campus is different than all the other campuses you go to. This one is really, really apathetic. People are really, really passive. And that happened to me so often that I began to think of an answer that went like this. Let's spend some time naming the situation on this campus. Apathy, cynicism, a jock culture, whatever. And once we've finished laying that out, then the question is, what are we going to do? Are we going to knock on doors in the dormitory? Are we going to organize an action? Are we going to stand on a certain street corner every Monday morning at 8 a.m. with banners about the war? Are we going to have a film series? Are we going to have a reading series? Are we going to have a lecture series? What are we going to do? And that to me is the point that follows the point you're making about this is what they've done to us. Then the next question is, and I'm not able to answer this for you, but the next question is, once we've named the political moment, let's name the forces that we can imagine mobilizing for a strategy to win. So here we are in the middle of the teacher strike in Chicago. Somebody pointed out, I think one of you pointed out, okay, so here we have this mayor and we have the school system, and we're $38 million short of what we need to resolve the strike and to resolve the conflict. We could do it with $38 million. That's 1/2 of 1% of the city budget. So we could do it with, if we just had $38 million. So what did we do today after we picketed? We marched on a city-funded project called Lincoln Yards, which is a huge giveaway of billions of dollars to corporations to create a whole neighborhood with gentrification, with new buildings, new businesses. And a dozen of our teachers split off and went to the headquarters of the corporation, got arrested today. That was what that group of people decided to do to counter the thing. So here's the reality in Chicago. Our last mayor, Mayor Emanuel, closed 50 schools in black and brown neighborhoods. He closed 50 schools in one fell swoop. Now you know, because you're school people, you know what that does to a neighborhood. It's more than closing a school. It's closing a center. It's closing history. It's closing a legacy. It's closing a site of possibility and hope. So we were all furious about it. But then the mayor proposed and began to build a $95 million police academy. So 1/3 of the Chicago budget goes to police. And he's going to build a police academy while he closes schools. And so what did we do? Well, we said, first of all, we developed a way of talking about it. We said, this is social suicide. This is a recipe for social suicide. More cops, more money into cops, and less money into education, more kids standing on the corner. That's messed up. So that's part of what we did. And then part of what we did is we said, when we went out on strike this last week, we said, we want the money from that cop academy to solve this problem with the schools. These kids deserve a decent education. They deserve better than 40 kids in a kindergarten class. They deserve nurses, et cetera, and we're gonna close down your cop academy unless you can find the $38 million to close this gap. That's the kind of thing. So I don't know if you're following me because I'm kind of wandering around, but the main point is that as soon as you feel discouraged, push yourself further to name the political moment. 2% salary cut across the way. That's what they're proposing. And then the other thing is, just to get a little perspective on things, what the hell is happening in Santiago, Chile? What's happening in Beirut? What's happening in London? What's happening? You know about Santiago, Chile? Do you know about Beirut? Okay, Santiago, Chile, 1 million people in a country of 17 million were in the streets in Santiago over the weekend. 1 million, a 17th of the population. Imagine. And what was it about? Well, some people would say it was about the fact that they raised the subway fare.
Bus fare.
There's no way 1 million people came out because of the subway fare. They came out because the subway fare was the last straw of a government bound and determined to let the rich run away with the money and to penalize and tax the poor and the working people. And it was austerity all over again. Beirut, there was a tax on WhatsApp that kicked off the thing. There's no way that they're having that civil unrest because of WhatsApp. Nobody gives a shit about WhatsApp. What they care about is what that represents in terms of one thing to screw us up. And I think that you couldn't have predicted and I couldn't have predicted what's going on in those places. But it's also true that the day before Rosa Parks sat in on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama and kicked off the modern civil rights movement, nobody could have predicted that either. So we don't always know. But what we do know is we can consciously, every day, because the world is dynamic and in constant motion, so every day we can start anew to make a concrete analysis of concrete conditions. We can ask ourselves, what is this political moment and what does it demand of us? And then we can try things. And then for me, you know, I have a different way of thinking of this sometimes, but for me, the question of political activism can be measured in a kind of pedagogical rhythm. And the rhythm is this, that you have to open your eyes and pay attention. There's no way to be an activist if you're not opening your eyes. There's no way to be a good citizen. There's no way to be a moral person if you don't open your eyes, pay attention, make a concrete analysis. Step number 2 is to be astonished. Astonished at the misery that people inflict on one another, at the unfairness and unjustness that's inflicted on certain groups and certain peoples. You have to be astonished at that. You also have to be astonished at the ecstasy and the beauty all around you. What an amazing thing we are, and how we're capable of such greatness. And I think kids remind us of that too. Then you have to act, and then you have to doubt or rethink. So it's a simple 4-part rhythm. Pay attention, be astonished, act, doubt, repeat. And when you're doubting, when you're thinking about, after you've done your acting, after we got arrested at this corporate headquarters, or after we marched on the cop academy, the rethinking always involves asking yourself, what did I learn and what did I teach? And that's why it's a pedagogical standard. What did I learn and what did I teach? It's not good enough to say, man, I looked so cool with my bandana and my Molotov cocktail. Who cares really about how you looked on the news? I mean, I could care less. Who cares how you felt? What we care about is, did you teach anybody? Did your action teach? The problem is, there's no way to know beforehand whether it did. That's why it's very important as a responsibility to then step back and say, did I teach? Did I learn? How do I know? Now I'm getting ready to act again. I'm getting ready to open my eyes again. Pay attention, be astonished, act, doubt, repeat. That's my simple recipe. Simple to say, very, very hard to do. But I think it's worth keeping it in mind.
Maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. Does anybody? Yeah, Alex?
He said right next to the camera, and he also raised his hands.
Okay, how about you two? Do you want
Hi, Bill. I just for yourself, like kind of one of the key actions you're just talking about was inspiration. So what are some of your principles or practices about staying connected to community for your own inspiration? Because I think that's a challenge with all the kind of, even with ourselves here, we're pretty cushy teachers here. Like to stratify and be real comfortable is pretty easy. But how do you build community and network and stay connected to the streets?
Well, you know, one of the things that, I mean, I think you've almost named it yourself. I mean, in a way you have named it yourself, because, you know, as a teacher, I always drew inspiration from my students. It was always my kids and the parents that I relied on. When the teacher's lounge or the teacher's room or the 3rd floor of the College of Education became too cynical and too whiny, I found that the parents and the kids knew who cared about them, and they stood by you, and you could stand by them. That always has inspired me. But to take that to a larger realm, you can't really make strategy and tactics. You can't really find your bearings unless you're proximate to the people you care about. You have to be near the people you care about. So I've done a lot of work in prisons. You have to be proximate to people in prison. You can't make policy or make ideas or make strategy away from the people you care about. So I want to commit to being proximate to the people I believe are the people who are deserving of justice, who are deserving of a fairer break. That's step 1. Step 2 is you have to commit to being hopeful, because the world will mess with you again and again. And that means there's a rhythm, I think, to staying alive to the struggle, and part of that is taking care of yourself. I mean, I'm not a big believer in the kind of movement of self-care exactly, but I know what they mean. And I think that the great revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg was imprisoned during World War I for refusing to back Germany in that traitors' war. And there's some great letters between Rosa Luxemburg and her community. But one of the greatest is somebody writes to Luxemburg and says, "Oh, Rosa, we're devastated with you in prison. We don't know what to do without your leadership. We're falling apart. Woe is me." And Rosa Luxemburg wrote back, and she said 2 things that I love. She said, first of all, she said, "Stop whining. because whining will not take you anywhere, and you've got to get over yourself. And I think that's good advice for teachers. It's good advice for activists. There's nothing to be gained from telling everybody how sad we are and how miserable it all is. That doesn't get you anywhere. But then she said the second thing, which I think is brilliant. She said, my advice to you is to be a mensch, M-E-N-S-C-H. It's Yiddish. And you don't have to look it up, because she went on to say, I can't define mensch for you, except to say that a mensch is someone who loves her own life enough to enjoy the sunrise and the sunset, to enjoy a glass of wine with friends, to take care of the elders and the young people. And a mensch is also one who loves who loves the world enough to put her shoulder on history's wheel when history requires. And to me, it's finding that balance between loving your life and loving the world. I remember saying to a community group shortly after Trump was elected, and we were pretty depressed, as you can imagine. And I remember saying that loving your own life and enjoying your own life is, in a weird way, in the age of Trump, an act of resistance, because everything is so miserable that loving and being loved can itself be an act of resistance. It's not enough, but it's part of it. So I want to be proximate to the people I care about. I want to commit to staying hopeful, and I want to commit to acting on behalf of that hope, even when it seems ridiculous.
Nice. Good.
Hello, America. Hello, America.
Yeah.
That's all.
Right. So my question is that when we're looking at creating democracy in education and really unlocking that potential within our students, one of the things that I've grappled with throughout my studies, even to this point in PhD, that I'm having trouble answering is, how do we really grow that democracy from within when our decision-making like mechanisms, our methods are so authority-driven, so authoritarian, and when we're trying to grow this democracy from the grassroots in our students, when it exists alongside a heavily authoritarian structure of the school, of private enterprise being so tyrannical and being used as a vessel to further drive authoritarianism within our society, as well as, of course, things such as the driving of slavery as a punishment via prisons. So I'm wondering, how do we grow that democracy when it almost seems that to do so with so much working against it, around it, is almost what seems to cut off that possibility from the need?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think that what you're describing is true. I think democracy, I mean, what we live in the United States, and I believe in Canada as well, is a partial, fragmentary, sometimes aspirational, damaged perversion of democracy. But it is nonetheless worth fighting for. And the democracy I want to fight for is a participatory democracy, a democracy in which a principle that I think should guide all teachers is true. And that principle is that that every human being is of incalculable value. Every human being that you see around you is of incalculable value. And not only are human beings of incalculable value, but living things themselves are of incalculable value. And yet we spend so much time in authoritarian schools, anti-democratic tendencies in schools. We spend so much effort and so much money trying to calculate the value of people who have incalculable value. And it's a contradiction that can drive us nuts. But I think that in schools, we can say to each other, and we can build spaces where we enact the idea that the full development of each individual is the condition for the full development of the community. And the full development of the community is the condition for the fullest development of each individual. And that again is kind of a funny way of defining a contradiction that we have to somehow work our way into. The problem with little democratic experiments is they can be crushed under the heel of the authoritarian boot, and often are. One of the reasons that the free schools of the 60s, including a wonderful school in Canada started by Bob Davis, I can't remember quite the name of it, but Bob is still quite old, but he's still living. It was a Summerhill school outside Toronto. But these experiments in freedom had a hard time living in an authoritarian system. Look, if you say every human being is of incalculable value, and then you live in a system where there are winners and losers, and the whole name of the game seems to be winners and losers, you are pushing a rock up a hill. But it's worth pushing that rock up the hill for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that it's the only way we keep the sparks of democracy alive. It's also worth doing because sometimes the calculus of being a social activist and the calculus of being a fighter for justice, the calculus is not victory, even though we do want to win. The calculus is your own humanity. So even though we can look around us and see all the forces aligned, to crush us and for authoritarian answers to schools and society and everything else, to give in to that is to lose your soul. And so I think it's worth saying that I always remember when I think of this that, I went down when the state of Illinois reinstated the death penalty. I went down to the state prison all by myself at midnight because my partner had to put the kids to bed. We drew straws and I won. So I went down to stand in front of the prison and object to the fact that they were going to kill somebody in the electric chair. And when I got down there, there were 2,000 young people with beer and boom boxes celebrating the death of this guy. And I crept to the front of the prison with my little "Thou shalt not kill" sign. And there I found 9 elderly nuns, a couple of lawyers, and me. And we sang freedom songs and held candles. And if I've ever felt marginal, and I often do, that was marginal in the extreme. They did kill the guy. The crowd cheered. The 12 of us went home unhappy. And 2 years later, Illinois abolished the death penalty. One of the guys standing there with me had won the first wrongful conviction suit in Illinois. And from there, we organized an unstoppable movement against the death penalty. We're now organizing against prisons. And, we'll see where that goes. But you can feel. But, what was important to me about that night is that it's not that I thought we were going to win, although we did win that particular struggle. It's that I thought that I didn't want to live with myself if I wasn't standing there saying no to that death penalty, to that particular death. I couldn't. So it was, in a certain sense, it was an existential protest, but it also had a practical meaning, and you can't predict what the practical meaning will be. You can't predict where you're going to come from. So we ended up convincing our reactionary, corrupt governor to become a death penalty abolitionist. It took years, but we did it, and we did it by building a mass movement. And so I'm a huge believer in it. The other thing I would say, just because it comes to mind, is that think about the life of somebody like the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, born into slavery. Famously, his master famously told him, his master beat him because he was learning to read, and his master shouted at his wife and said, reading will unfit him to be a slave. And I always loved that phrase because it's true. Literacy and knowledge and wisdom will unfit you to be a slave. Frederick Douglass was born in slavery, escaped, became a leading voice for abolition. He convinced, if you read Lincoln's second inaugural, that could have been written by Frederick Douglass. He saw the most amazing victories. He was wanted, he was hunted, but he saw the Civil War come. He saw the second inaugural address. He saw the abolition of slavery. He saw Reconstruction. And then he saw the betrayal of Reconstruction. He saw Black people put back into bondage. And do you think he went home crying? No. He tried to figure out where's the next place I'm going to fight? Where's the next? you just can't allow yourself to do that. So nobody would have believed in 1850 that slavery could be abolished, but it was. And then to see it set back 15, 20 years later, what a horror, what a nightmare. And yet Frederick Douglass kept fighting to the end of his life. How can we do any less?
Thanks. Well, Bill, once again, you've given us lots to think about in a very eloquent and personalized manner. I like that little show of your place there.
Well, this is my apartment. Look, that's the windows. And here, I'll show you one thing. I can take this over here, I think. So we're way up high over Lake Michigan. You're not going to be able to see much, but I'll do my best.
I kind of saw that means I'll never get to see your guest room, the guest writing place. But
yeah, well, you should come and you can come and live in it. That's the Museum of Science and Industry across the street. Amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, and so yeah, come and have a writing retreat, Mark. Why not? And bring all of those students with you.
They'll want a field trip, yeah. All right, the last thing I want to say.
You need a field trip, exactly.
Bill, thanks so much for always being so generous with your time, your knowledge, your experience. And I think a perfect way to end might be is to say that you're a mensch, Bill. And really appreciate everything that you've given us to chew on and to think about and to strive to hope for a better world. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for being there.
All right, thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye.
That's the union's name.